Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jessica Rodriguez, and I'm the Industry Engagement and Outreach Officer for the Data Science Institute here at Columbia University. Today's seminar is an iCubed, which stands for Institute, Industry, and Innovation. These seminars connect our industry affiliates to our students and the larger Columbia community to explore topics at the forefront of industry. We invite data scientists, engineers, and researchers from our affiliate partners to give a talk about a recent project, case study, or the data science work they are engaged in. During these educational events, we encourage attendees to ask questions via the Q&A chat feature or here in person, as we're doing this hybrid today. Today's talk is titled Use of Data in Financial Services. And our speaker today is Ekta Sahini, Managing Director, Cloud First, Global Data and Applied Intelligence at Accenture. Yay! About today's talk, banking continues to face disruption from fintech's digital assets, climate risk, privacy, data localization, and cybersecurity regulations. It's also critical to use the vast amounts of data that is generated that financial services have access to. It is becoming increasingly the responsibility of the Chief Data Office organization to democratize data and make it available for broader use across an organization. In her talk, Ekta will speak about the implements of use, suggest a framework to operationalize.
That's right.
Pardon, and discuss use cases that are in place today. And with that, I welcome Ekta to.
No, thank you so much. Yeah. I'll try to keep it as relevant as possible. Good afternoon. I have been at Accenture for a year now, and I lead the global data management and governance capability across our clients. In a past life, I spent my career in financial services. I was at JP Morgan in my last role, heading up their data governance, data management across, and then I had, as all of you will have at some point, a midlife crisis, decided to do something different with your career, and decided to do some of the data management and governance concepts across industries, and hence Accenture, which works vastly across clients. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm hoping is relevant as you kind of get into your fields in banking or wherever else. And the good thing about being a data scientist, a data management governance person is that some of the foundational skills that you have are very relevant across industries because you work across the same data set. So hopefully it's useful. And then just ask questions like, interaction just helps with some of the conversations and helps my learning as well as I talk to you and learn from you guys as well. So I think just in terms of talking about 2022 and the COVID and the fact that we're still doing hybrid and sharing data across, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about some of the trends that banking has been seeing. Obviously, the banks have always had a lot of data. So example, when I was at JP Morgan, our credit and banking business touches like 60 million households. So that's look at the amount of customer interaction data that we have. But also banking, like healthcare, is an extremely regulated industry. So how you use the data, how it is accessed, how a customer expects the data to be used is a big part of the decisions the data management and governance organization has to make around touching that customer data. So a lot of the ways which banking is kind of adopting is that they're kind of balancing out some of the reputation and ethical uses of data with the actual frameworks and governance that kind of to make it available and democratize it. And I think that's some of the things that you talked about when you made the introduction. So the other piece that I wanted to touch upon was that banks can't just sit and do nothing. Fintechs are there. If you kind of look at Digit app that you use or Plaid or any of the aggregators in the marketplace, they are accessing customer data. They are not as regulated as banks because they're fintechs. So the answer to do nothing is not the answer anymore. So there's been a lot of urgency at a lot of financial services in the last few years to adopt strong data management and governance practices to enable the use of data. Some of the challenges that we talked about here, and I'll talk about them with respect to banking because that's I'm the most familiar, having grown up there. But they kind of across industries as I work in my last year at Accenture across like healthcare or telecom and others. Customer expectations are are way beyond what a legacy banking system can meet. Fintechs are out there. Customers, as in you guys, me, expect to be treated fairly without any discrimination, expect that the privacy and protection rights on their data will be met. They're also expecting like an optimized omni-channel experience. So as an example, if I have a credit card with Banana Republic and Chase, or with Synchrony, actually it's with Synchrony, you expect that Synchrony, the bank, is going to make an offer to you at the right time when you're at the mall shopping for a Gap product or an Atlanta product or a Banana Republic product. So it's not like that a lot of our customers are averse to offers. They just want to make sure the offers are made at the right time. So what's being important is that the companies who are beginning to use customer data specifically have to maintain digital trust. And how you do that is very critical to a data science function, because access to sensitive data, personal information becomes a big part of how in the future you will handle data models, data cases, and all of that. And we'll talk about that. In terms of there's an increased pressure on banks, like, just the cost of data management and governance is expensive to do. So balancing it out in terms of having a very pragmatic approach in terms of how you approach data management becomes pretty critical. There's also, especially with like some of the younger generation who are like kind of now out making the purchases, making the decisions on how they want to use, there's an expectation that banks and other companies as well do good. There's a social responsibility which banks want to have, and banks are in the middle of enabling growth through AI, ML, or machine learning examples, but they're also ensuring that they're meeting like an individual's expectations of privacy and in advancing human knowledge in the right way. So as an example, during COVID, when I was at JP, some of the top banks actually came together during COVID to release de-identified transactional credit card data, and that could be helped in getting a view in terms of where the spending was happening, how the PPP would be allocated, where how to make state-specific decisions and stuff like that. So it's important to kind of make that data available for good as well, which I think a lot of the financial institutions are doing that now. And lastly, I think regulation becomes critical. It's continuing to evolve. I think North America or US is the only country which does not have a privacy law. We have laws in California, we have Virginia, we have Connecticut is coming up next year. So it's very state-specific, but all across the globe, GDPR is there, it's in Europe. China has its own privacy regulation, India, Brazil, all the others. So there's a lot of expectation around both privacy and localization. So how do you enable analytics while keeping data in place? Because you can't move the data. So my experience with understanding how a Chinese customer behaves versus a North American customer versus Europe kind of becomes very critical in terms of how you apply your data science models across those industries. So these are some of the trends which are impacting how people look at data and data use. I won't stop for questions. I'll just kind of go through the questions in the end. So because the slide normally gets questions, so that's why. But so I guess the question here is how can the industry reinvent using the power of data and analytics? And this is a slide, and I know it's a very dense slide, which has the full life cycle of data. So this is Accenture's data management framework, and the data management and governance function, which is this area that you sit in red, kind of sits across the ecosystem of data life cycle. So when you think about data management and governance capabilities, there's a data integration function, there's a data modeling function, there's a data engineering function, which I think all of you will be experts in. But there's a very critical piece of it, which is called data management and intelligence governance. That focuses on the quality of the data. So actually, when the data science does touch it, it's actually good quality and fit for purpose. It looks at metadata, which is data about the data, so that when you are actually touching, say, payment data or receivable data, you as a data scientist can be confident that it's actually payments data or receivables data. So the data management and governance functions works before the analytics organization comes in and actually starts touching and playing with the data to ensure the data is organized and cataloged. So think about it as a library. There's a dictionary which has the terms that tells you what the quality of data is. There's a marketplace which you can use to say, okay, give me access to this data set so I can do my analytics. If it's in the banking world, they'll tell you that, oh no, it's regulated, it's China data, so you can't have access to it. We need a Chinese resident who can only play with the data, or we'll create a sandbox environment. So some of that function around operating model, ethics, quality of data is all that kind of happens in this function within through the overall life cycle. What I did here was I just put some definitions. I won't spend a lot of time, but essentially think of metadata as data about the data. So if you just knew that this was Ekta Sahni sitting in a receivables database in a credit card, like in a bank, that would be fine, but you need data about me. So you need to know whether I'm a California resident, what kind of products I have with the bank. So some of the data about me, which is metadata, is what is cataloged in our repository. Think about it like that. Lineage is the flow of data. So how I started in a consumer onboarding system and how I went into collections or receivables or end of life or whatever. So it's basically the data flow. And data flow becomes very important when you want to make sure that you're using the right data in the right way. So a lot of times, as data scientists, you'll be asked the question around, do you know the provenance or the lineage of the data? So as an example, if you're using third-party data, which could be off your weather app, but if you're using that data for a data model, it would be something which would be talked about, like how and why are you using third-party data, which a customer was probably using just to check the weather, but you're using the digital footprint to kind of market to them. Is that appropriate or not? So the lineage conversation happens a lot in any industry that you go to, and especially in banking or healthcare, which are more regulated industries. Data quality think about it as fit for purpose. So it's essentially ensuring that the data is of a good quality. So if you remember, like, I don't know how much of you followed in the news, Citibank has been in the news for some of the data quality issues that they've had in the last year and a half through some of the regulatory reporting, putting a few extra zeros on a payment and some of those, and not having those controls and checks in place to ensure the data quality is of good measure. Glossary and taxonomy is just essentially a definition. Master data is your most critical data. You want to make sure that data is like centralized, it's in one place, it has rules of use, it has rules of access, and some of those. Discovery is a function, it's an automated way of discovering data. It could be sensitive data, it could be race data, it could be ethnic, whatever, gender. So you need to make sure that some of those data are cataloged appropriately. And then operation model, process, privacy, and ethics are things that you want to think about as you bring in the data use pieces of it, which a centralized data governance organization would do. So I guess as we kind of think about how the industry is using some of these levers, I wanted to kind of spend time on how they're using these levers to kind of reinvent themselves. So I think I won't talk about all of the pillars here. I kind of think of these bricks as like little Lego blocks. So depending on where you are in your data management and governance journey, you implement those Lego blocks to make sure you remain pragmatic around your data use and actually kind of continue to make progress. So, but I'll talk about the 5 circles at the top. So the first one, I guess, is implementing regulatory change. I think that, for example, GDPR, CPRA, any regulation that comes across is foundational. If you don't have the regulation in place, you're not compliant, and the regulators are going to shut you down. So that, to me, is the most critical. Whatever it requires, any regulation, you need to make sure you're compliant on that. Once you have done that, you can start building on the pillars of migrating to the cloud, making it better, scaling your analytics, building your data models, doing all of that in the realm of like implementing regulating change. So to talk a little bit about, I guess I can look at modernized data governance. A lot of the CDO and CDO, so when you go into like the real world, the financial services, banking, or any other world, there a lot of companies are kind of rethinking their CDO, CDAOs. There's now a function called Chief Data Officer and a Chief Data Analytics Officer, and those functions are either merging or they kind of stand separate. Essentially, the Chief Data Officer is responsible for implementing all these data management and governance capabilities, and the Chief Analytics Officer is responsible for making use of that data and the capabilities coming up with the innovative use cases. A lot of times these functions are kind of getting merged. So when you kind of start working with some of these organizations, you'll see a CDAO function, which works together both to ensure regulation is implemented, data is modernized, and you're scaling your analytics and you're doing your responsible AI, ML, and some of those concepts. Um, what else is there? I think, yeah, in terms of the last bullet, I can't see it here, but I think we had talked about like scaling analytics and others. The piece there is that there's a lot of technology which is now available to be able to speed your analytics. So as an example, at Accenture, when we work with our clients, we set up like synthetic data sets. So the data set is not real data, so it does not have PI, personal information, but it looks like real information, and hence a data scientist can model data out of that, determine if it's a viable use case, and then put it to use. Or there's technologies available in terms of multi-party compute where you keep the data in place, and I think that becomes a big part of innovation because if the data is regulated, it's hard to kind of get your hands on. So even if you have like the coolest ideas, data is not going to be available to kind of actually put those ideas in action. So kind of creating some of those environments becomes very critical for any organization to be successful. Like that's the big differentiator between who actually is successful in implementing AI ML and who isn't. And I guess this is what this says is essentially they need to evolve to remain competitive, and that's what banks are doing. And they need to capture ideas. So when you, as data scientists, as you kind of go into the organization, there's going to be a piece of the organization which kind of starts looking at you and the analytics organization to come up with creative use of data and have quick ways to test them out and see if they can scale, or if not, just go to the next idea. So I'm going to talk about a little bit around how a bank actually makes those decisions in terms of allowing access and use and analytics around this data as well. So this is an example of how it usually works, and this actually comes from Mondelez, which is one of the clients that we worked with. The biggest, it's like kind of like it's always a chicken and egg situation when you actually go to a corporation. There's a ton of effort required in organizing the data, making sure it's the right quality, making sure it's regulated and governed. And then there's a lot of pressure in saying, okay, I know I have 60 million household data. I want to put it to use. I want to get analytics. I want to look sexy. I want to do my models. So how do you balance the needs and the expense of data management with actually driving value from the data? And how you do that is you create like a hypothesis engine. You kind of look at ways in terms of how you want to build out your ideas for your organization, test them out, set up a factory to kind of churn out the ideas and then build on them. And that factory could actually be, I'll talk a little bit about it. I think this is not, I'll bring it to life in another example, but it's important to kind of create, focus on the problem, a business case, get focused on that, see how much of it is scalable, and then implement it. Which is a big part of what happens through in an analytics organization in a bank or a healthcare company or wherever else. So these were actually, I wanted to touch upon these. So these are like sample use cases. So this is like what a data scientist could work on. And like as I mentioned, it gets expensive very fast to create fit-for-purpose data and kind of come up with use cases which actually are possible to implement given the regulation and others. So a lot of the effort which happens here in terms of the hypothesis engine and the spoke is around coming up with reusable data sets that can be used again and again. Customer and interaction data and employee data is one such type of data set which can be used for multiple uses. So bringing across like customer touchpoint data to enhance customer experience, so you can bring data from like email, from chat, from web interaction, browsing habits, transactional data that can help optimize like a call center experience. So when you call a call center to kind of ask for a new credit card as an example, they can understand your interaction data, what you like, what is the usual time you call, some of the factors about you as a customer to be able to give you the best experience. And that same data set can also be used in collections, can be used for productivity, can be used for various reasons. So the sample industry use case when a bank or any institution is trying to say, okay, I have all this data, what should I do? At Accenture, we would say, how about building out your customer experience? and building out that data set. That would be the first data set that we would go to. The other one, which is becoming very common, is employee experience. With some of the COVID stuff that has happened and the hybrid working and the lessons that we're doing, workforce data is now being used to optimize like hybrid working models, optimize real estate footprints, like, in terms of whether we should have an office in New York City. If we should, can we like reduce the space, the leasing space, depending on number of people who come in, benchmark with peers across industries and some of those pieces. So that workforce data is another piece of data set that you will be used extensively. In retail banking and even across investment and commercial banking, data is used to reduce cycle time for decision making, credit decision making. So how do you think about when you go in and apply on the web for a credit card versus when it goes to a manual underwriting process, how you can kind of scale that process and make credit available? There's also a ton of effort under risk mitigation to actually combine third-party data with first and second-party data to kind of come up with like a good way to kind of know customer credit limits that need to be decided, and data is being used extensively in that space as well. In terms of top-line goals and others, in the middle office, banks are focused on using data to modernize their process for anti-money laundering, for fraud, and providing new ways for credit worthiness. And then lastly, the other places where there's a lot of companies now that are actually becoming tech-focused so that they can understand data and lineage and workflows. And they are looking at automating back office tasks, looking at flows of data and some of those pieces as well. So the biggest piece, that I guess the thread which runs across all these use cases, and these are the ones that I advise my clients on in terms of, okay, how do you bring value, is that you bring the data together from the correct system of record, so you know where it is, you know what the lineage is, you ensure that it fits a purpose, and then you ensure that it is deployed in the right way as a use case, so you can actually implement it in a model or implement it in a certain scenario to test it out. So any use case that you do, it'll never be rolled out like full scale to like 60 million households or to a call center operations or whatever. It'll always be a small pilot, a hypothesis that you test, and then you scale it out depending on interactions and new data that you collect and some of those pieces. And you'll see that happening a lot. This I wanted to talk about. It kind of fits into data management and governance, but I want to, as you kind of go out into the working world, so think about like, there is regulation which tells you, can we do something? So purely like, privacy regulation will tell you, do not use customer data for something. And then there's ethics, which tells you, should we do something? And that's where, especially with the onset of like AI, ML, and some of the other analytics, there's a huge focus on, regardless of whether there's regulation or not, ethical use of data should happen. And a lot of the banks and even healthcare, and across industries, are coming up with ways of becoming data which requires governance and data which can be broadly used. So I'll give you an example of one, and you'll see that it kind of moves up the spectrum. So primary data is essentially data about me. It's the data I gave to an organization so they could fulfill my credit card transaction. They could do whatever is needed to fulfill their duty towards me. Observed data is data which a bank has about me based on my interactions. How many times I use the Zelle app? How many times do I call up the call center? I'm not giving the data to the bank. They're just observing things about me. And I think the tertiary data, I think it's called, third-party data, is essentially data that a bank can buy from other places. So they could buy my geolocation data from a third-party aggregator. They could buy other types of data about me or whatever else, and then they want to combine it. So primary data, which is used for conducting core business about me, is something which I'm totally comfortable using, letting the bank use. But if that same primary data, if a bank is thinking about selling to third parties or monetizing it anyway, which a lot of companies are now thinking about monetization of data, that's the one which you want to have a strong risk-benefit discussion. And it has to be qualitative. It can't be quantitative. It has to be qualitative around, should we do this? The black and white around ethical use of data. And especially when that primary data lands in a model, or you want to make sure it's explainable, there's no bias, there's equal representation. So some of those pieces are very important conversations that happen When I was at JP as an example, and as we work with our clients, we advise the data scientists to meet with like the privacy, the legal, the data management organization. So you have like a 360 view on what that data is, how it is being used, how a customer perceived it was being used, and some of those, and it's bringing out some of those data elements which require governance or not. It becomes a big part of how we do. And it usually goes up to the CEO and board because it's their responsibility. So there's a lot of making sure that you use the data and you're democratizing it, but you're doing it in a very appropriate, structured way. So I think just to kind of talk a lot about the use cases and how we go about implementing is, I think it just depends on where the maturity of an organization. As I work across, like a lot of the clients that I'm with now, a client getting into it for the first time may have just the need for implementing like a privacy regulation because they operate in Virginia. Virginia has a law on privacy. They need to implement data management, want to make sure their Virginia residents are protected. Somebody else who is a larger scale, like a retailer or somebody else may have a broader need around data analytics or others. So it just depends on, do they have a CDO? What is their operating model? How mature are they? And some of those practices to determine how to kind of think about use cases and data sets. And these were some of the consideration factors that we talked about, which kind of determine how to approach them. But essentially, when you kind of look at the overall structure of data management and governance, we kind of look at all these consideration factors and kind of ask the client to tell us or we help them think through what are their critical data assets. And then let's start at least having a plan to kind of govern them, know where they are, where they sit across the organization, and some of those pieces, and then begin to kind of pull out the use cases. I think that's all that I had. Any questions or thoughts or?
I do have one.
Mm-hmm.
Because I see one of the slides that mentioned the cloud data, and I know that for now a lot of corporations start to using cloud data and such as from the provider like Amazon, but there are actually some data breach, like in past a few years, like Capital One, right?
That's right.
So yeah. So do you think the very impractical practice that the corporation should adapt to protect their data, the cloud data?
That's right. So the data is available for use, and there's two aspects of on how an organization looks at data protection or data security. So one is protecting all data by protecting it for a cyber breach, incident response, making sure it's all protected, which sometimes it happens through a security function or a lapse or whatever else. But then the other piece is when that call data comes to an analytics function, a data scientist, that protection happens by stripping it all of its PI. So when a data scientist gets call center data to mine or model, it doesn't have any direct identifiers. So if that is breached, it does not matter because it's totally scrubbed. But the Capital One breach that you talked about was actual call center data, which was like, yeah, so that's a part of, like, I think with some of the state of security and cyber, it's a part of what the banks do try to protect it, but then they sometimes fail. But the use of data for analytics is always synthetic or scrubbed out of PI. But it's the most available to use data set. Yeah.
I think the Capital One is because the hacker actually, she was working for the Amazon.
That's right.
She knows the flows in the...
Exactly, yeah. And there's only so much. They have privacy and they have code of ethics and all of that you sign up for as an employee, and then some of that happens.
Actually, that goes a little bit with another question that we have. That's how to manage a crisis of data breach if controls fail.
I guess there's lots of ways how to manage. So I think there's incident reporting that you do to your customers to kind of let them know that the breach did occur and how to kind of do the credit monitoring and all of those in place. But I just want to clarify, so the data management and governance function does not look after security or cyber for an organization. Data management and governance function will tell you where the data is, whether it's sensitive data or not, and hand it over to a security function to say, okay, security, now that you know PI exists in these technical assets, and these technical assets are facing outward, so external vendors have access, it's on a website or whatever, it's your duty to protect it both in rest and in motion. So the data management and data scientist organization will not necessarily be responsible, and the cyber and the security organization comes up with the most innovative ways of protecting data based on type of data, based on the use of the data, and based on who can access it. So those are the three levers that they use to kind of manage it.
Sorry, I believe you were going to ask a question.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's growing up is bias, algorithms.
That's right.
In the court system, they use algorithms to sentence
Yeah.
children, whatever. And within the African American community and Hispanic community, they are saying that there's a new redlining, bank loans, credit cards, mortgage, business loans are not being given out because of maybe their zip code or.
Exactly.
I don't know. I don't think it's because of the race, just because it mentioned the race that they won't give it to you. But there are other factors that they put into the algorithm, which allows the banks to deny service.
Yeah.
So how do you counter that? I mean, is it through educating the data scientists about diversity or having board members with diverse backgrounds?
Yeah. I think it's the way to think about it is that should we do it on the ethical scale? It's the unintended consequences of data use or misuse. And it was, to your point, it probably wasn't intended. And I don't know if you remember, there was a Goldman example where two credit card issuers were, the woman got a lower credit limit than the man, and they were both exactly the same. So some of those are unintended consequences. So I think it happens at two levels. One is when, and this happens like day to day on a banking world when you do go in, is that the data scientists who work on these kind of models are usually, there's a lot of push in making sure they're appropriately diverse, coming from different backgrounds, understanding and all of that to ensure that the data set represents that. So, and that has always been the big challenge, because when as an example, when we give you data for risk and underwriting, we'll strip it out of all race, we'll strip it out of PI and everything else and let you build a model. But on the reverse, we need to check that model to ensure it's not biased for a certain race or for a certain zip code and others. So testing some of those models becomes very important before they're actually deployed. And that's a big function of like data governance, to ensure that the testing occurs before the model is deployed. And then broadly, I think it's that board level piece, which is a big part of it. As an example, a lot of banks, before they implement a new model for credit worthiness, they will always implement it first for credit expansion and then do worthiness. Because expansion helps them test the model, and it's not a bad thing. You're actually expanding credit. It could be to anyone, but they're actually testing it out, that theory first, before adopting it for another reason. So some of that explanation, and the regulators are also learning, right? So it kind of becomes a data scientist, a data management, governance organization's responsibility to do it right. I think it's unfair to kind of think that the regulators would catch everything, or because they're also learning and the technology is new.
Actually, was the NASDAQ? Just I think about 2-3 months ago, they just issued a new regulation saying that their board members with member companies should have at least one person of a minority
background, yeah.
Board. So I don't know, maybe that would.
It helps kind of form out the opinion a little bit, exactly. And they always say like one is never enough, because then they don't have the power to speak up. 2 is the right number, is the one that is, because if it's one minority number, they may never feel empowered to kind of say that, have you looked at something, when they actually are looking at a data set to deploy it. So it's always finding it in numbers, but it is a big part of how organizations are approaching. There is a ton of governance that happens within a data scientist organization. So it's not just about playing with the data.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation. Uh, we have another question. What is the timeline of scaling the data management data science solutions from hypothesis to a regional or global deployment?
So the answer is it depends, unfortunately. But I would always say that when do data management and data science together in parallel, because very quickly, if you just do data management and forget about data science and actually putting that data to use, data management function becomes a cost center and becomes very expensive. And very soon, the CEO and the senior leadership at a bank or anyone are going to start questioning, like, why am I spending so much time organizing my data and discovering it when I'm not doing anything with it? So kind of think of it as a life cycle of data and start use cases. So, and use cases, I can, like, I know I said it depends, but we set up at JP Morgan, the JP Morgan Chase Institute, which is basically a de-identified data set of our customer card transactions, and it is using that data for policy decision making and others. It took to scrub the data, make sure it's got no PI, set up the use cases. It can take up to 12 to 18 months because it's ensuring that the data is fit for purpose. You have your lineage, you have your quality. It kind of takes that basic maturity, and then you kind of work on it once you start putting data to use. So you do need, as you get into that organization and you start meeting with leadership in data science organizations, ask them about their vision, ask them about like their path to success and what they think. So I think it's a very valid question in terms of when you'll actually start like working with the data to actually learn, like deploy some of the concepts that you learned at university.
So like the big time managers or CEOs of a company, do they really listen to the data?
Yeah, big. Yeah, like I can give you. So it was like at. I hope this is like being recorded, so I can't. So yeah, there is a ton of visibility. There's a couple of reasons why they listen. One of the reasons why they listen is regulation. They need to be compliant, and the bank can like Citibank had to stop growing because the data management practices sucked. And the second reason that they listen is because they see it as a competitive edge. Banks are being handed over, like, that's why they're making so many partnerships with fintechs and others, because they are using the data so much more better than the legacy banks. And they understand that it's a competitive edge, and they want to be able to deploy it. So a lot of the CDO functions, CDAO functions are actually work either directly for the CEO or they work one level below the organization. So.
Usually that I was reading this research, and men usually managed by conflict and overconfidence.
Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Women usually managed by consensus,
yeah,
and stuff. So I'm imagining all these CEOs of big corporate offices been there for 40, 50 years. Maybe they don't want to listen to the technology, or maybe they don't want to listen to.
They have to.
Yeah, I think to stay competitive, to be able to do that. And at least coming from JP Morgan, I think Jamie was one of the first like speakers around data management and why it was important. I think regulation was one, and the second was aggregators. That was a big piece around customer data. So imagine like I don't know how many of you use like mint.com. It's been taken over by Intuit, right? So you all log on to Mint and you give your authentication data, your Chase card, your any other transaction data, and you give it to Mint and you let them go into Chase and everything else and pull your transactions. So there was a lot of banks had a lot of data security and protection concerns about these aggregators taking your customer data and taking your passwords and credentials and just essentially screen scraping. So a lot of the reasons was the Mints and Intuits of the world were not regulated while the banks were. So if there was a breach, the banks would be held liable and would be in the news versus the aggregators. So it's a competitive piece of understanding. So Jamie was like big around saying that we need to start governing our data, stop the screen scraping, make sure our customers are aware about privacy, transparency of use, and let Mint come in. If you want to use Mint, do it, but do it in a very where the passwords and the credentials are not being exposed to third parties. So there's like various reasons which drive some of that, but there is a ton of understanding around analytics and data management. There's also a lot of affiliations with universities like this. I think that thought leadership needs to come, especially around like bias, transparency. How do you ensure that a model works? How do you test for de-identification? Some of those technologies, especially banks and financial institutions, are not as mature, so they're always looking for talent who can actually enable a business case. There's a lot of good business case story and material, but not how to do it. So they kind of bank on the data scientists to be able to enable.
And how secure is the cloud? I mean, it's secure as
It is a lot of the banks have been slow on getting on the cloud. I think only Accenture did a study. I think only 20 or 22% of the data was on the cloud, and the rest of it is not. They are afraid. It is not because of security. I think it's more to do with the fact that they don't know what they're putting in the cloud right now, because they're all on the data management journey and they haven't necessarily like cataloged it or secured it. So they started with a lift and shift approach to the cloud. Let me take this technical asset, let me move it on-prem, move it to the cloud. But that didn't work because there was still like the concerns around security or concerns around what data is in the cloud, what is not, and you had to be able to kind of demonstrate that to your regulators and others. So then they slowed down cloud deployment, started governing the data, and now are moving data to the cloud in a hybrid. So not all critical data assets, but some. And especially for analytics, like a lot of banks use the sandbox environments and others to kind of speed of compute and all of that. So that's very, very prevalent.
You were going to ask?
Yeah, I have a very general question because given your working experience in both bank and consulting companies, so how do you describe the difference between the work style in the different corporations?
Yeah, it's I'm still learning consulting, frankly. Like, so all of us are on this learning journey. But I think even if you go into consulting, I would encourage. I think depth of industry is very important, and that's what I always encourage. So the cool thing about consulting is you can pick your projects; they're time bound. You can work on it, and you can go deep and then come out. So I think that's like a very cool aspect of consulting. Banking, the data scientists that we were hiring, the cool thing was that they were kind of seeing the wing-to-wing approach of how to enable it. The bank had a ton of focus on it. So it is a mix in terms of what you do between consulting and banking, but I would definitely say industry expertise is important because you just need to know some of that regardless of which field you're in, and it's like an anchor point. And then I think the other advice I would do is in different points in your career, every 3 to 5 years, go deep and then come back up. So you get like a strategic view. So take like that corporate job, which you might think is only PowerPoint, but it's really important to do that because then you get like a Jamie Dimon view or a Julie Sweet view because you're getting like, okay, why am I doing this? Because you went back up. So always every 3 to 5 years, go deep, come back up. So I think that's important for growth as well, as you kind of get on your corporate journeys.
So that's why there's a very popular question that interviewers recently like to ask. How do you see yourself in 3 to 5 years?
Yeah. So I think I'll answer that through constant learning and then kind of navigating it. So.
Actually, could you tell us a little bit about your career and what brought you to your current role at Accenture?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I've done something very similar. Like I think I started out right after school and went really deep into financial reporting. Was getting tired of like the Excel files and the day-to-day, like the quarterly reports, the year-end reports, and used Master Black Belt in Lean Six Sigma. At that time was very popular to kind of get into operations. So for like 10 years in my career, I managed like call centers, customer service operations, credit card processing, application processing. So the actual day-to-day job of ensuring somebody gets their credit card on time or gets their application processed on time and some of those, and then use that because that was again deep to kind of go into like data management and governance. So that kind of helped me set the stage in terms of, okay, now I know about everything I need to know about credit card and banking and some of those pieces. I can begin to leverage it for that actual use, and I've actually lived and breathed it, which was I think important, which makes the story come out a lot more authentic. So I think that becomes very important. So and then consulting was just a own personal development thing. I could have done banking for the rest of my career. I might still go back, and I was just thinking, there's so much happening across banking. I would love to know what's happening across industries, healthcare, retail, and others. And Accenture was a good way to kind of just learn. So I think that continuous learning and development opportunity is important, regardless of where you are in your career. Like, somebody would say, like, why would you do it at this stage? But I think it's the being that sponge becomes important, especially so you're not like stagnating.
Thank you so much. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, what skill you think can make a candidate stand out in the
Say that again. What?
what the skills do you think can make a candidate stand out in the bank
Okay.
for the data science position?
For a data scientist, I think the biggest question that I don't know if you've been asked during your interviews, which we used to ask is like just critical thinking questions. I have to land 7 planes. There are 3 runways. How would you kind of land them? Like, just like that level of critical thinking to come up with answers, to come up with ideas and hypotheses on how to test certain data sets is important. I think the use cases and stuff you'll get by experience once you join a bank. But and then I think the other big piece is which I think a data scientist is extremely important, at least the good ones that I worked with, is having a 360 view of the problem. So not just the small piece of work that you are looking at, which could be call center data, but how it sits within the entire credit card life cycle of a customer and how that customer interaction data is going to touch. So some of those pieces become very important. And then I think there was a lot of discussion around technical ability. A lot of data scientists, I don't know if you see that, I would love to know, like, a lot of our data scientists used to complain that they used to spend 70% of their job just prepping the data. So, like, setting it up for processing, making sure it's ready, and some of those, and only the 30% of their job was doing the cool stuff. So we were trying to change some of that dynamic because there's a lot of effort spent in like bringing these data sets together, making sure it's clean, making sure it has like, testing and all of those pieces, profiling it, and some of those. So there's some questions around that. Just to give a realistic estimate to a data scientist that the job is not all sexy and working on, it's a lot of grunt work as well, to keep the data available.
It kind of answers one of my questions, which is like, what is a typical day look like for a data scientist,
Yeah.
entry-level data scientist?
There's that, and then there's a lot of governance.
Yeah.
So the data scientist does build out this use case. So when I had this story up on this, a data scientist will be expected to build a story around what is it that they're trying to test along with their manager. So it might not just be you going in out cold, but you will be working with your leadership to kind of think through the data set, whether you want to create a synthetic environment, whether just stripping it out of PI makes sense. Like, because you want to balance, and that was the big conversations we had with data scientists, was you still want to make the data that it can be used, right? If you strip it out of everything and make it totally de-identified, it might not even be good for you to use. So what's that right balance of putting the controls, but then yet making sure you're getting insights out of that? So this equation was something with privacy and legal was something which was discussed to ensure the right controls are put in place.
Yeah.
Yes.
I wanted to ask, because you said a lot of the data governance laws are really like decided by the state in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that in the future there will be like a federal kind of level?
Yeah. I think if Biden stays, there's a lot of conversation, especially amongst to kind of have a national privacy law. But even if there's no national privacy law, a lot of the U.S. corporations are just adapting CPRA, California regulation, because that looks and feels a lot like GDPR, which is in EMEA, which looks and feels a lot like LGBT, which is in Brazil. So that is like the standard. I think there's a little bit of discussion where some of the states are saying that they also want to localize their data. So want to keep it in, so California resident data cannot be accessed by New York or whatever. So I think some of those, I think a federal law will take that away because it'll be data for North America, so U.S. citizens or whatever. So some of that conversation is happening, but that definitely is a possibility to have national regulation around privacy.
It's one of those things that getting a lot of politics involved now. So
Yeah.
Chamber of Commerce is saying something, and progressives are saying something. So now it's getting very murky, like in Congress. I don't know.
Exactly. But I think regardless of that, it just makes good business sense, right? Because it's one is regulation, but then the other piece is also what a customer expects out of it. And like maybe not so much in banking, but I was working with some of our cosmetic companies, like the Estee Lauders and the L'Oreals of the world as clients. They care a lot about customer, and they are using a lot of data and biometrics to kind of ensure like the makeup look is all right and how the data is protected and stored and some of those. So there's a ton of conversation happening even in that industry around privacy and transparency of use and making sure you're told how your data is being used and some of those pieces.
Hey, my alarm. Do you know if anybody else has any final questions? No?
No.
Wanted to thank you so much for this wonderfully fascinating, dynamic
Thank you.
discussion and presentation today. Thank you so much, and we hope that you'll come back to visit us very soon or
Absolutely.
engage with our students. Thank you.